On February 14, 2017, deep-sea scanner operators testing equipment off the western shore of Lake Tahoe came across a strange signal. The device confidently showed that an object that didn't look like a piece of debris and didn't look like a rock was hovering below the boat at a depth of more than 350 feet. At first, the cameramen thought it was a technical malfunction. The lake often confuses the equipment due to sharp depth changes and cold currents. But when they lowered the camera probe and saw the outline of a human figure suspended vertically in the darkness, it became clear that they were looking at a non-natural find. A heavy boulder was tied to the silhouette's ankles with a thick nylon rope, and the clothes, although faded, were almost completely preserved. 20 minutes later, the Coast Guard received the coordinates. This was the beginning of the story that led investigators to the name of Ella Patton, a girl who disappeared 6 months ago in Desolation Wilderness and was thought to be the victim of an accident. But the first hours of the investigation showed that there was nothing accidental about her disappearance. Someone had deliberately lowered her to the bottom of Lake Tahoe so that she would never surface. On August 12, 2016, a Friday, the city of Sacramento was hit by a wave of stifling heat. 24-year-old Ella Patton, who worked as a waitress at the Valley View Diner, had finished her shift late the night before so that she could go on a day trip she had been dreaming about for the past few weeks. For her, this trip to the Desolation Wilderness was not just a sporting interest, but an attempt to escape from the monotonous noise of dishes, endless orders, and 12-hour shifts on her feet. In her diary, which would later be included in the case file, she wrote that she needed the silence that only exists where the asphalt ends. This time, Ella did not take her own car, as it was being repaired. Her best friend, Sarah, offered to give her a ride. Sarah had a scheduled appointment with a realtor in South Lake Tahoe to rent a small business space, so their plans were a perfect match. They agreed on the logistics. Sarah would drop Ella off at the start of the route in the morning, drive into town to take care of business, and return to the same spot in the evening to pick up her friend. At about 8:30 in the morning, Sarah's black Chevrolet Malibu pulled into a rocky, dusty parking lot near the Glen Alpine Trailhead. This location, located southwest of Lake Tahoe, served as the gateway to one of the region's most popular yet rugged trails. In the interview report, Sarah noted that Ella was in high spirits. She quickly checked the contents of her lightweight backpack, a bottle of water, sandwiches, a map, a phone, and a thin, bright yellow windbreaker. This piece of clothing would later become the main reference point in the search orientation. The girls agreed on a time once again. Sarah had to be at the parking lot at exactly 18 hours 00 minutes. Ella got out of the car, adjusted the straps of her backpack, and laughing, promised not to be late, reminding her that she had an early shift at the diner the next morning. Sarah watched her friend's bright yellow jacket disappear around a bend in the rocky path that led deeper into the forest. That was the last time she was seen visually. Ella left the last confirmed digital trail at 9:15 in the morning. Her cell phone registered with a cell tower located near Fallen Leaf Lake. At that point, she sent a short text message to her mother. The text, recovered by police, was succinct. "I'm on the route. The connection is about to go out. Sarah will pick me up at 6. Love you." Ella Patton's phone was never seen again. According to the plan she had told her friend, her goal was Gilmore Lake, a picturesque body of water surrounded by granite peaks, where she wanted to take a series of photos. At exactly 18 o'clock, Sarah returned to the Glen Alpine parking lot. The sun was already sinking into the west, casting long shadows over the pine trees. She waited for 15 minutes, then 30. The parking lot was gradually emptying, the tourists were leaving, and the silence was becoming more and more oppressive. At first, Sarah assumed that Ella had simply miscalculated the time of the descent or was delayed because of the beautiful view. But when the clock showed 19 hours and 30 minutes and the caller's phone kept going to voicemail, her anxiety turned into cold panic. When darkness fell at 25 o'clock, Sarah drove to the nearest El Dorado County Sheriff's Office without waiting for her friend. The report of the officer on duty recorded that the applicant was extremely agitated and insisted that Ella never broke promises about her return time, especially before work shifts. A full-scale search operation was launched at dawn on Saturday, August 13th. The situation was complicated by the absence of Ella's car at the entrance to the forest. The rescuers had no base camp or additional items that could tell them how she was equipped in detail, except for Sarah's words. Volunteers and professional dog handlers from the Tahoe Nordic Search and Rescue Group began combing the route, meter by meter. At first, everything looked standard. The dogs confidently picked up the trail from the parking lot. They led the group up a rocky road, passing the historic ruins of the old resort, and headed toward Lake Gilmore. However, near the remains of the old fire station, where the dirt path turns into massive, sun-heated granite slabs, the trail abruptly ended. The dogs circled in place, unable to find the continuation of the scent chain. The dog handlers explained this by the specifics of the terrain. On a hot stone, the scent disappears in minutes, leaving no trace. The rescuers interviewed dozens of tourists who descended the route on Friday night and Saturday morning. None of them saw the girl in the bright yellow windbreaker. No backpack or water bottle was found, nor were there any slip marks on the scree that could indicate a fall. The helicopter patrolling the area from the air also did not detect any thermal anomalies or visual contact in the open areas. The search lasted 2 weeks. An area of several dozen square miles was searched, including inaccessible gorges and the shorelines of high mountain lakes. But the result remained zero. In an official sheriff's report dated August 27, 2016, the operation was reclassified as limited monitoring. Investigators and volunteers had to admit, Ella Patton walked into the forest on a sunny Friday morning, said goodbye to her friend, and simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind not even a broken branch. Exactly 6 months have passed since the day Ella Patton last got in touch from the forest path. February 2017 was an abnormally harsh month for the Lake Tahoe region. Prolonged snowfalls were followed by gale-force winds that raised ocean-like waves on the lake, turning the usually calm blue water into a leaden, pitch-black abyss. Locals said that the lake in such weather looks like a living creature that does not forgive mistakes and reliably hides its secrets. The water temperature on the surface barely exceeded 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and at the depths it remained consistently icy, preserving everything that fell into its arms. On February 14, 2017, despite the harsh weather conditions, a team from the private company Sierra Deep Scan entered the water to conduct technical tests. They were testing a prototype of new high-resolution sonar equipment designed for detailed mapping of the bottom topography. To calibrate the sensors, they chose the Rubicon Point area, a site off the west coast known for its steep underwater cliffs. Here, the bottom does not sink smoothly, but falls in sharp terraces where the depth reaches more than 1,400 feet in a few hundred yards from the shore. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, a sonar operator watching the monitors in the cabin of the research vessel noticed a strange anomaly. A clear mark appeared on the screen amidst the monotonous bottom topography, noisy due to the storm. It didn't look like a flooded tree, which is common in these parts. Old pine trees that fall into the water usually lie horizontally or get stuck at an angle. The object that the scanner captured had a strict vertical orientation. It was hovering in the water column at a depth of about 350 feet, not touching the bottom, but as if balancing on a small underwater plateau. The operator's report, which was later included in the case file, states that at first the team mistook it for a technical failure or a buildup of debris tangled in old fishing nets. However, the stability of the signal made the team leader decide to conduct a visual check. For this purpose, a remotely operated underwater vehicle, ROV, equipped with powerful searchlights and a camera capable of transmitting images in real time was used. The descent of the vehicle was slow. On the screens in the ship's wheelhouse, the dark blue water gradually changed to blackness. The depth meter showed 100 feet, 200, 300. When the vehicle approached 340 feet, the operator turned on the main lights. The beam of light cut through the dense, icy water, snatching small particles of silt hanging in zero gravity from the darkness. The vehicle made a slow turn, adjusting to the coordinates of the anomaly. What appeared on the screen in a few seconds made the whole team fall silent. It was not a log, and it was not garbage. A human body was slowly swaying in the cold light of the searchlight. It was hanging upright, facing the open lake, its arms floating freely along its torso, obeying the weak underwater current. The water of Lake Tahoe, whose temperature at this depth remains at 39 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, worked as a perfect refrigerator. The decomposition processes were so slow that even after 6 months, the clothes and facial features were still recognizable. The ROV's camera zoomed in, and the details were clearly visible on the screen. Dark hiking leggings, professional trekking boots, and a bright yellow windbreaker that, although it had lost its original luster under the layer of silt, still contrasted with the surrounding darkness. It was the same outfit Ella Patton had worn when she got out of her friend's car 6 months earlier. The cameraman, trying to keep his composure, began to move the device down along the body to understand why it did not float to the surface and sink to the bottom. The laws of physics in cold water often behave unpredictably, but here the reason was terribly obvious. The camera dropped below the level of the boots and snatched a detail from the darkness that instantly turned the situation from a disappearance into a scene of a brutal crime. A thick braided rope was tied to the girl's ankles. It tightly covered her legs in the shin area, cutting into the fabric of her pants. The rope went down, stretched like a string, and disappeared in the darkness under the victim's feet. The operator added power to the machine's engines to go even lower, and a beam of light fell on the weight source. At a depth of several more feet, a huge, uneven stone hung beneath the body, a piece of granite rock, rough and untreated. It was a heavy boulder, weighing at least 50 or 60 pounds, that someone had deliberately tied around with the same thick yellow nylon rope. The knot on the stone looked sophisticated, professional, made so that the load would not slip out during the dive. The picture on the monitor was static and eerie. A girl who seemed to be frozen in her step, held at the depths by this barbaric anchor. It was obvious that this burden had not been tied in a hurry. The design itself, the way the legs were tied, the length of the segment to the stone, the reliability of the knots indicated a cold calculation. Whoever did this knew for sure that simple physics and the immense depth of Tahoe would hide this crime from human eyes forever. If not for an accidental test of new equipment, Ella Patton could have remained trapped in that icy cave for decades. Just another name on the list of missing persons. The Sierra Deep Scan team immediately stopped recording the coordinates and contacted the Coast Guard dispatcher and the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office. The message read, "A human body was found tied to the cargo. The depth is 350 feet. We need a team for deep water recovery." While they waited for the services to arrive, the ROV remained underwater, illuminating a yellow jacket that moved subtly in time with the underwater currents, the only spot of color in a realm of eternal cold and darkness. The recovery operation, which began immediately after receiving the coordinates from the Sierra Deep Scan team, turned into a grueling confrontation with nature that lasted almost a day. The weather at Lake Tahoe, which had been unstable in recent days, deteriorated to critical levels. The gale force winds were raising waves several feet high, rocking the rescue team's technical platform and forcing the winch operators to work with extreme caution. Every sudden movement of the vessel threatened to cut the cables or damage the evidence that had been preserved by the icy water for 6 months. The team had to wait for windows of relative calm to lift the cargo from a depth of 350 feet in stages. The rescue team leader's report describes the process as a technically challenging maneuver in zero visibility and a storm warning. It was not until the next morning, when the wind had died down a bit, that the body finally crossed the water-air interface. He was carefully placed in a special container, being careful not to disturb the position of the ropes and the stone that had been acting as an anchor all this time. When Ella was brought to the Placer County Marine Corps, it became clear how unique the conditions of Lake Tahoe's deep water environment are. The low water temperature, which remains consistently low at depth, and the lack of sunlight slowed decomposition processes to a minimum. Visual identification was possible almost immediately, without the need to wait for DNA test results. The girl was wearing the same clothes described by her friend Sarah on the day she disappeared. Dark, tight leggings, professional hiking boots, and a bright yellow windbreaker that, although covered with a layer of silt, had not lost its color. During the preliminary examination, one of the assistants noticed a detail that caused an emotional reaction even among experienced morgue workers. Around the girl's neck, tangled in the collar of her jacket, a silver medallion on a thin chain shone faintly. When it was cleaned of plaque, the engraving on the back became visible. It was a gift from her grandmother that Ella's mother mentioned in every interview during the 6 months of searching. This small piece of silver became the final confirmation of her identity, even before the experts compared the dental records. There was no doubt left. Ella Patton had returned from Desolation Wilderness, but not in the way her family had hoped. However, the true horror of this story was revealed only during a full autopsy performed by the county's chief pathologist. The investigators present in the autopsy room expected to see signs of a classic violent crime: a head injury, strangulation marks on the neck, or stab wounds. Logic dictated that the killer would have first taken the victim's life and then disposed of the body. But Ella's body told a completely different story. The expert methodically examined every centimeter of skin. The bones of the skull were intact. The spine was not damaged. There were no characteristic bruises or fractures of the hyoid bone on the neck, which would indicate strangulation with hands or a noose. No penetrating wounds were found on the chest or abdomen. The girl seemed to be physically healthy, except for the effects of being in the water. The situation became clearer when the pathologist examined her lungs. They were unnaturally heavy and filled with fluid. Laboratory analysis of tissue samples revealed the presence of specific microorganisms, diatoms. An important detail was that these particular types of algae are found only in the deep, clean layers of Lake Tahoe and are not found on the surface or in groundwater. The conclusion, which the expert recorded in the official protocol, sounded in the silence of the morgue like a verdict of cruelty by an unknown criminal. The cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation due to drowning. The victim was alive at the time of immersion in water. This meant a blood-curdling scenario. Ella Patton was not killed on the shore. She was tied up, taken to the middle of the lake, tied to a load, and thrown overboard while fully conscious. She could feel the icy water enveloping her body, the heavy stone pulling her into the darkness, and the air in her lungs running out as she sank to a depth from which there was no return. The murder weapon was on a nearby table for physical evidence. A massive piece of granite was tied to Ella's ankles with a thick braided nylon rope. It was an irregularly shaped, untreated boulder weighing about 60 pounds, with sharp edges that indicated it was of natural origin, probably picked up somewhere on the shore or by the road. The stone acted as a foolproof anchor. The killer had calculated everything precisely. The weight was sufficient to instantly pull the body to the bottom and keep it there despite any gases generated during decomposition. However, it wasn't the stone itself that caught the forensic experts' attention. There are millions of such boulders on the Tahoe coast, and it's almost impossible to trace the origin of a particular piece of granite. His attention was drawn to the method of attachment. The rope was not wound randomly. It covered the victim's legs and the stone with frightening precision and expertise. The forensic scientist, who specialized in trace evidence, took a long look at the knots under the bright light of a lamp before making a note in his notebook. The rope was tied in a complicated knot that did not loosen even under the strong tension and resistance that the victim undoubtedly exerted in the water. The inspection report contained a detailed description. A professional double constrictor knot with an additional locking loop element for reliability was used. This discovery instantly changed the profile of the potential killer. The double constrictor knot is not a knot that an ordinary tourist ties to secure a tent, nor is it one that amateur fishermen use. This is a specific, extremely reliable knot used by people who are used to fixing loads tightly without any room for error. It is typical for professionals in certain fields: industrial rigging, construction of high-rise structures, logging, or handling heavy cargo on ships. This knot has one peculiarity: the tighter the rope is pulled, the tighter it is clamped, and it is almost impossible to untie it after loading. You only have to cut the rope. The person who tied Ella up did it automatically, with the muscle memory of hands that had tied such knots thousands of times. He did not experiment and did not panic. He knew that this knot would withstand the weight of the stone and not allow the body to come free. It was this piece of yellow nylon, tied in a dead noose, that gave the investigation its first real thread. The killer was not a random vagrant or office worker. He was a man with manual labor skills, a man who knew how to securely tie a load. And this professional detail became the only trace he recklessly left at the bottom of the lake, believing that the water would safely hide his work forever. Now the detectives were faced with the task of finding someone who knew how to tie such knots and understanding exactly where the paths of the waitress and the professional rigger crossed. Detective Michael Sorensen, who took over the investigation after the shocking discovery at the bottom of the lake, realized that this was no longer a case of disappearance, but a complex technical task of reconstructing the logistics of the murder. The forensic examination proved that Ella Patton had not been thrown from the shore or pier. The depth at which she was found and the massive boulder tied to her feet indicated that the perpetrator had acted in open water. To take a live woman and a 60-pound boulder to the middle of the lake at Rubicon Point, a motorboat was needed. And this boat had to enter the water unnoticed, under the cover of night. Investigators began to methodically work out all possible access points to the water. Lake Tahoe is a huge, highly regulated system. Most large marinas and yacht clubs have clear security protocols. The gates are locked after sunset, the perimeter is guarded, and any movement of vessels is recorded by surveillance cameras or entries in logbooks. Detectives checked dozens of locations on the west and south coasts. The logbooks for the evening and night of August 12, 2016, were either empty or contained entries about boats whose owners had an ironclad alibi and returned to their berths before dawn. The inspection seemed like an endless routine until the investigators' attention was drawn to a small, secluded location called Silver Pine Marina. It was a private marina hidden in a deep bay, away from the main tourist routes and noisy highways. It served mostly local boat owners and did not have a modern digital access control system. It relied on old paper logs and physical security. While reviewing the duty schedules, Detective Sorensen came across a personnel detail that instantly stood out among hundreds of other names. On the night of Ella's disappearance, August 12th to 13th, a 50-year-old security guard named Garrett Vance worked the night shift. His name had not appeared on the list of suspects before, but one circumstance made the detective wary. Exactly 3 days after that night, on August 15th, Vance quit. It wasn't a planned resignation. According to the marina manager, with whom Sorensen had a detailed conversation, Garrett simply called in the morning and said he would not be coming to work. He didn't work the required 2 weeks, didn't pick up his personal belongings from his locker, and didn't even come to pick up his last paycheck, which was still in the accounting office safe. This behavior looked like an escape for a man who had worked at the place for almost a year and was considered a reliable employee. The manager provided details that allowed the investigation to recreate a possible scenario for that night. Garrett Vance, as a night guard, had full, unrestricted access to the entire infrastructure of Silver Pine Marina. He had his own set of keys to the main gate, to the technical rooms, and to the ramp mechanism for launching boats. That night, he was the only person on the premises. He did not need to make a record in the logbook, did not need to report to the dispatcher or pass by the cameras. The video surveillance system at the marina had not been working for several months, and Vance was well aware of this. Moreover, the investigation found that the security guard did not need any outside transportation. The manager confirmed that Vance kept his own boat at the marina, an old shabby aluminum Lund boat with a fairly powerful outboard motor. The boat was on a trailer in the maintenance area, just a few dozen yards from the water. This information closed a major gap in the crime's logistics. Vance had the perfect opportunity. He could drive his pickup truck onto the property, close the gate behind him, drive right up to the ramp in the dark, transfer the bound victim from the back of the truck to the boat, and launch it. No one would have heard the sound of the motor amidst the noise of the wind, and no one would have seen the lonely boat leaving the shore into the night. To the outside world, the marina looked closed and asleep, while inside, something was happening that would change Ella Patton's fate forever. When Sorensen returned to the station and ran a full background check on Garrett Vance, the last piece of this eerie puzzle fell into place with a loud click. The suspect's dossier showed that working as a night guard was a relatively new job for him, a kind of retirement after a much more difficult professional path. Before getting a job at Silver Pine Marina, Garrett Vance had worked in the construction industry for more than 15 years. He was not just a laborer, but a foreman for a large company specializing in high-rise steel erection and industrial rigging. His job required him to move, lift, and secure multi-ton loads at height on a daily basis. His professional card included certificates for safety and working with ropes. This meant that he knew perfectly well how ropes behave under load. He knew how to tie knots that would not untie, that could withstand jerks and a weight many times greater than the weight of a human body. Detective Sorensen put the printout of the biography next to the photo of the physical evidence from the previous chapter, the same complicated knot on Ella's feet. Now it didn't look like an accident. The double constructor with a locking loop was his professional signature. It was a knot that Vance had tied thousands of times on construction sites, securing beams and equipment. That night, in a stressful situation, his hands simply did what they did best: secure the load. Only this time, the load was a living person. The connection between the night guard, who suddenly disappeared, and the manner of the murder was obvious and undeniable. Now the investigation had to find the person who turned his professional skills into a murder weapon. The investigation, which had received a powerful impetus after the identification of the knots on the victim's body, seemed about to end with an arrest. Detective Michael Sorensen was confident that a visit to Garrett Vance's last known address would answer all the questions. A search warrant was obtained in record time, and the task force arrived at a small rental house on the outskirts of South Lake Tahoe, expecting to find, if not the suspect himself, then at least traces of his crime. However, the reality was disappointing. The door was answered by the owner of the house, an elderly man who looked genuinely surprised by the police presence. According to his words, recorded in the interrogation report, Garrett Vance moved out in mid-August 2016, just a few days after the night Ella disappeared. The owner said that Vance paid in cash, threw the keys in the mailbox, and left a message saying that he had found a job in another state. For forensic experts, this was the worst-case scenario. For more than 5 months, another family had been living in the house, a young couple with a child. They had completely redecorated, repainted the walls, and removed the old furniture. When the detectives asked about things that the previous tenant might have left behind, the owner just shrugged. He explained that Vance had left behind a pile of junk in the garage and backyard: old clothes, broken tools, boxes of garbage. The owner personally took all this to the city landfill back in September, preparing the house for new tenants. Physical evidence that could have contained Ella's DNA or traces of preparation for the crime was destroyed by time and utilities. The situation looked like a dead end. The suspect had disappeared, the crime scene, the boat, had disappeared with him, and the residence was sterile. However, Detective Sorensen decided to shift the focus of the investigation from the physical space to the financial space. He understood that people like Wayne's, systematic, organized, accustomed to order, rarely disappear without a trace at a single moment. There had to be a thread somewhere that he had forgotten to cut. Analysts from the Financial Investigation Department gained access to Garrett Vance's bank accounts. Most of the transactions confirmed his lifestyle, purchases at hardware stores, gas stations, cheap eateries. But one regular transaction caught Sorensen's attention. Starting in January 2016, on the first of every month, a fixed amount was automatically debited from Vance's account to Summit Storage Solutions. It was a large complex of private storage facilities located on the southern outskirts of the city. The last payment was made on August 1st. In September, a chargeback attempt was rejected by the bank because Vance had withdrawn all the cash and blocked the card before fleeing. Sorensen immediately contacted the warehouse administration. The manager confirmed that box number 404 was indeed rented in the name of Garrett Vance. Since payment had not been received for 6 months, according to the terms of the contract, the administration blocked access to the unit by hanging its red lock on top of the customers. However, fortunately for the investigation, the contents of the box had not yet been put up for auction at a confiscated property auction. The procedure was scheduled for the following month. After receiving a new warrant, the investigation team arrived at Summit Storage Solutions 2 hours later. As a warehouse worker cut the padlocks and lifted the corrugated metal roller shutter with a clatter, stale air filled with the smells of machine oil, old rubber, and dust wafted in from the darkness. The beam of a flashlight caught the space, which was packed with things up to the ceiling. This place was not just a warehouse, it was a full-fledged workshop and archive of the life of a man who was used to working with his hands. Inside, there was perfect order, typical of a professional foreman. There were boxes of tools on the shelves, labeled with a marker. In the corner were stacked old boat engines that Vance was probably repairing for sale. Coils of electrical cables, hydraulic hoses, and industrial climbing kits hung on the walls. Vance used this room to store his professional rigging equipment, which did not fit in his small rented house. The forensic team began a methodical search. They were interested in one particular item, and they found it on the bottom shelf of a metal rack in the back of the box. There, between a box of bearings and an old battery, was a large industrial coil. Several hundred feet of thick, braided nylon rope of bright yellow color was wound around it. Even upon visual inspection, the rope looked identical to the one removed from Ella Patton's body at the morgue. The same diameter, the same specific shade, the same weave structure with a characteristic black marker thread inside the fiber. The end of the rope on the spool had been burned with a lighter, just like the ends of the pieces found at the bottom of the lake. The samples were immediately sent to a laboratory in Sacramento. Rapid analysis conducted the same day confirmed a complete match. The chemical composition of the polymers, the number of strands in the weave, and even traces of manufacturing lubricant on the fibers were the same. It was a rope from the same batch. But in box 404, they found something else that Detective Sorensen called a behavioral fingerprint. As investigators examined the walls of organized tools, they noticed the way Vance stored his belongings. Heavy rubber water hoses, extension cords, and cables were neatly wrapped in rings. To prevent them from falling apart, Vance tied them with short lengths of the same yellow rope or old shoelaces. Sorensen asked the forensic scientist to get closer and take pictures of the knots. Each hose, each cable, was fixed in exactly the same way. These were not random loops. Every single item in that garage had a perfect, tight, double constructor knot tied around it with an extra locking loop. Tying knots is a muscle memory. A person who has been working with loads for years does not think about how to tie a rope. Their hands do it automatically. Vance used this knot for everything: to tie up old newspapers, to secure a tool, to hang a motor. And on that fateful night, stressed out on a boat in the middle of a lake, his hands did what they had done thousands of times in that garage. He used his familiar, reliable, professional knot to tie the girl's legs together. The discovery in the warehouse turned circumstantial suspicions into a solid evidence base. The yellow rope linked Vance to the crime scene physically, and the knots linked him psychologically. Now the investigation had everything except Garrett Vance himself. There was only one question left. Where could a man who had so carefully prepared his disappearance but left the key to his own exposure locked in a metal box on the outskirts of the city go? Garrett Vance disappeared from South Lake Tahoe as professionally and methodically as he had done his work on construction sites for the past 15 years. Immediately after his abrupt dismissal from the Silver Pine Marina in August 2016, he effectively erased his digital identity. Investigators found that on August 15th at 9 o'clock in the morning, he withdrew all available funds from his bank account through an ATM on the outskirts of the city. This was the last confirmed financial transaction under his real name. He then threw away his SIM card, turned off his phone, and turned into a ghost. Detective Michael Sorensen, analyzing the suspect's actions, realized that standard search methods would not work here. Vance was the type of person who knew how to live off the grid. He was used to hard physical labor, could sleep in a car, eat cheap canned food, and work for cash without leaving a trace in tax records or Social Security databases. Searching for him through credit card transactions or social media activity was a futile exercise. He simply did not use them. The only tangible link to him in the real world was his vehicle. Vance escaped in his old dark green Dodge Ram pickup truck, a 1998-year-old model. For him, it was not just a car, but a mobile home, a toolbox, and the only asset that allowed him to make a living anywhere in the country. Sorensen was betting on this. The former foreman, who was used to relying on himself, would never leave his pickup truck voluntarily. The vehicle's license plate was immediately entered into the NCIC, National Crime Information Center, National Wanted Database with a high-risk mark. A description of the vehicle, including distinctive dents on the rear, a khaki Kung, and a reinforced front bumper, was sent to patrol services in all neighboring states: Nevada, Oregon, Arizona, and Utah. Silence on the air lasted for 3 days after investigators opened the storage unit and found the rope. It seemed that Vance could have driven the car into some remote canyon or painted it to change its appearance. However, on February 17, 2017, at 3 in the morning, the automatic license plate reader, ALPR system, gave the first and decisive alarm. A traffic police camera installed on a section of Interstate 80 captured a Vance pickup truck traveling eastbound. The point of capture was deep in the Nevada desert, hundreds of miles from Lake Tahoe. It was a region where only sand, dry scrub, and rare gas stations stretched for dozens of miles around. The system recognized the license plate with a 98% probability, despite the layer of dust and dirt on the bumper. Once Sorensen received the coordinates, he contacted the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office in Nevada. Traffic and geography analysis indicated that Vance was not just passing through in transit. He had settled in the town of Winnemucca, a small community in the middle of the desert, often referred to as an oasis in the middle of nowhere. This place was perfect for a person who wanted to disappear. It was where the paths of truckers, seasonal workers, and those trying to start life from scratch crossed. In towns like this, they rarely ask too many questions if you pay cash and do your job. Local sheriff's deputies launched a quiet search so as not to spook the suspect. It took them less than 6 hours to locate the target. A dark green Dodge Ram was found parked in the backyard of a cheap motel called the Dusty Sands Inn, located on the eastern edge of town, off the main street. The vehicle was covered with a layer of desert dust, and construction materials were lying in the back, indicating that Vance had continued to work. A check of the motel's registration book confirmed the investigators' guesses. Room 12 was occupied by a man who registered under the name Johnson. According to the administrator, he checked in back in October 2016, paid exclusively in cash every week in advance, and was extremely quiet. He never ordered room service, did not use the phone in the room, and avoided talking to the staff. Surveillance of the motel revealed the suspect's routine schedule. Every morning at exactly 6:30, the man would leave his room, get into his pickup truck, and drive to a construction site outside of town where new sheds for agricultural machinery were being built. He worked as a general laborer, doing the hardest work of assembling metal structures, hardly communicating with other workers, and eating lunch alone in the cab of his truck. Photos taken by operatives from a long distance left no doubt. It was Garrett Vance. He had grown a thick gray beard, lost weight, and wore a baseball cap pulled low, but the characteristic gait of a man who had spent his entire life on a construction site, and his profile matched the wanted manifest. Vance lived in the belief that the Nevada desert had safely hidden him, just as he believed the waters of Lake Tahoe had forever hidden the body of Ella Patton. He created a new reality where his name was Mr. Johnson and where no one knew about the yellow nylon rope. But he was wrong. While Vance was buying coffee at the gas station and returning to his room in the evening, an invisible ring was closing around the Dusty Sands Inn. Sorensen, who immediately flew to Nevada with the capture team, knew that he had to be extremely careful when taking on such a suspect. Vance was physically strong, had nothing to lose, and could put up a fight. The operation was scheduled for early morning, when sleep was at its strongest and reactions were slowest. Vance did not even suspect that behind the walls of his cheap hotel room, where he had been hiding from justice for months, the operation headquarters was already being set up. His perfect disappearance, built on cash and silence, was shattered by a single camera on the highway that saw what he was trying to hide. The desert was no longer his ally. It had become a trap with no way out. The dawn of February 18th was approaching, and with it, the end of his freedom. On February 18, 2017, at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, the silence of the provincial town of Winnemucca, Nevada, was broken by the sound of heavy footsteps of a Special Forces unit. The operation to apprehend Garrett Waynes had been planned to the second. Local police had sealed off the perimeter of the Dusty Sands Inn, blocking both exits to the highway, while Federal Bureau of Investigation agents took up positions at door number 12. They expected resistance. The suspect was a physically strong man with nothing to lose, and according to profilers, could go to extreme lengths. When the assault team kicked down the door and burst in, they were met not with resistance, but with complete, almost theatrical obedience. Garrett Vance was awake. He was sitting on the edge of a cheap bed, fully dressed in his work clothes, holding a paper cup of coffee. The TV was on in the room with the sound off. When he saw the muzzles of assault rifles and the light of tactical flashlights, he slowly, without any sudden movement, raised his hands up. The team leader's report states that Vance did not utter a single word of justification. The only thing he asked the officers before the handcuffs clicked on his wrists was permission to finish his morning coffee. It was the gesture of a man who had been waiting for this moment for a long time and was simply tired of running away. That evening, Vance was taken back to California under heavy escort to the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office. The interrogation was conducted personally by Detective Michael Sorensen. He chose the tactic of quiet pressure. He did not raise his voice, did not threaten, but methodically laid out the evidence collected over 6 months of hard work on a metal table. The first was a photograph of a yellow nylon rope found in his rented garage. The second was a detailed picture of the double constructor knot on the victim's legs. The third was a printout of his phone billing, which recorded his movements to the marina on the night of the murder. Vance looked at the photos for several minutes. He looked at them as if he were assessing the quality of someone's work. Then he sighed heavily, nodded to himself, and began to speak. His confession contained no remorse or emotional breakdowns. It was a dry, chronological account of the events that led up to the tragedy, and its banality terrified the investigators more than if it had been a horror movie script. According to Vance, that evening, August 12th, he was driving to his night shift at Silver Pine Marina on his usual route. On the side of Fallen Leaf Road, where the forest comes close to the asphalt, he noticed a lone figure. It was Ella Patton. She looked exhausted after a long hike, walking slowly with her shoulders slumped. Vance slowed down and offered to give her a ride to town through the open window, arguing that he didn't care about the journey and that darkness was approaching. Ella, appreciating her fatigue and believing in the safety of the situation, agreed. The first few minutes of the trip went as usual. He asked about the route. She briefly answered about the hike to Gilmore Lake. But soon, as Vance himself admitted during the interrogation, he decided to take the initiative. His tone changed, his questions became more personal, and his compliments quickly crossed the line. He began to hint that they could go to a nice place before he took her home. Ella's reaction was immediate and harsh. She didn't get scared in silence. She began to defend her boundaries. She firmly asked him to stop the car and said she would get out right there on the highway. When Vance tried to turn it into a bad joke and reached out to touch her knee, Ella pushed him away and uttered a phrase that became a sentence for both of them. She said that she had memorized his pickup truck's license plate number, had seen his face, and would report the harassment to the police as soon as she got a connection. At that moment, a switch was flipped in Vance's mind. He was afraid not of moral condemnation, but of very specific legal consequences. As it turned out later from the databases, he was on probation for a brutal bar fight that had occurred several years earlier. Any complaint to the police, even an administrative one, meant that he would immediately have his parole revoked and return to prison. His fear of losing his freedom instantly transformed into cold aggression. Instead of applying the brakes, he locked the central door lock and swerved the steering wheel to the right, turning onto the dirt road leading to the service entrance of the marina. The gate was less than a mile away. Ella realized what was happening. She started screaming, pounding on the side window to try to get attention, but there was only the night forest around her. When the pickup truck pulled into a dark, deserted boat storage shed, Vance stopped. He did not engage in a long struggle. Acting with brutal efficiency, he pulled a heavy metal fixture he was carrying for repairs from under the driver's seat, walked around the car, and opened the passenger door. When Ella tried to escape, he struck her once hard on the head, not to kill her, but to mute her, as he put it during interrogation. The girl lost consciousness instantly. Standing over the unconscious body in the silence of the garage, Vance began to calculate his options. He realized that the situation was out of control beyond repair. He could not let her go. She knew him, she knew his car, and she would go to the police. In his twisted logic, there was only one way to avoid prison. The witness had to disappear forever. He acted mechanically, like a robot performing a production task. Vance dragged Ella's body from his pickup truck to the side of a police boat. He then found a heavy granite boulder on the dock that was usually used as a stopper for an open gate. From his toolbox, he pulled out a rope. It was here that his professional skills became the murder weapon. He tied the stone to the girl's feet, using the same knot he had used for years to secure building beams, securely, with no chance of it coming undone in the water. He took the boat out into the middle of Lake Tahoe in complete darkness, guided only by the shore lights. The engine ran at low speed to avoid attracting attention. When he stopped over a deep depression near Rubicon Point, Ella was still breathing. Vance knew this. He could see her chest rise, but that didn't stop him. There was no room in his mind for pity or hesitation, only cold calculation. No body, no case. He pushed the boulder to the side and pushed it into the water. The weight of the stone instantly pulled the tied-up girl into the black, icy abyss. He waited a few minutes, making sure the water surface had calmed down, turned the boat around, and returned to his post to finish his coffee and finish his shift, believing the problem was solved for good. Garrett Vance's trial began on September 14, 2017, at the El Dorado County Superior Court building in Placerville. Contrary to public expectations, the trial did not turn into a high-profile television show with live broadcasts and crowds of reporters on the steps. The courtroom remained half-empty for most of the hearing, with Ella Patton's parents, close friends, and a few journalists from local newspapers sitting in the benches, dryly recording the proceedings in notebooks. The atmosphere in the room was heavy and devoid of theatrics. The prosecutor's office abandoned emotional speeches in favor of a dry, methodical presentation of evidence. The prosecution's strategy was based on the so-called 3 pillars that left the defense no room for maneuver. The first element was the same spool of yellow braided nylon rope seized from the defendant's rented garage. The FBI's examination confirmed that the chemical composition of the fibers, their thickness, and specific weave matched the fragments that had been used to bind the victim's body. The second key piece of evidence was the knots. An expert in maritime and industrial rigging was invited to the hearing, and he analyzed in detail the photographs from the crime scene and from Vance's warehouse in front of the jury. He explained that the use of a double constructor with an additional locking loop was a sign of occupational deformity. It wasn't just a way to tie a person up. It was an automatic movement of hands that had been practiced for years, used to fixing loads at construction sites. According to the expert, the identity of the knots on the hoses in the garage and on the victim's legs was a handwriting that could not be faked. The third element was Vance's own confession, recorded on video during the first interrogation. Although the defense lawyer tried to exclude this recording from the case file, citing his client's stressful state, the judge rejected the motion. The jury saw and heard Vance talking in a casual tone about how he dragged the body into the boat and looked for a stone on the shore. The line of defense was based on an attempt to mitigate the qualification of the crime. The lawyer insisted that the murder was not a pre-planned act, but happened spontaneously as a result of a panic attack and loss of control over the situation. He tried to portray Vance as a man who made a fatal mistake out of fear of losing his job and freedom due to probation. However, the prosecutor shattered this version with one hard fact that made the audience in the room shudder. According to the forensic medical examination, Ella Patton was alive when her body touched the water. The prosecutor emphasized that Vance had plenty of time to stop. There was time when he was driving to the pier. There was time when he was transferring her to the boat. There was a time when he was tying intricate knots in her legs. And there was a time when he was leading the boat to the middle of the lake. Each of these actions was a conscious choice. The fact that he threw a living, albeit unconscious girl into the icy water, tying a load to her, was qualified as an aggravating circumstance, murder with particular cruelty and knowledge of the consequences. Garrett Vance behaved distantly throughout the trial. He sat hunched over at the defense table and did not look up at the victim's family. He showed neither aggression nor fear. When the judge gave him the last word before sentencing, Vance mumbled a short, inarticulate sentence into the microphone. "I didn't mean for it to come to this." There was no remorse for the life he had taken. It sounded like the regret of a man who was simply unlucky that his plan failed because of an accidental sonar hit. On September 28, 2017, the judge announced the verdict. Garrett Vance was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. According to California law, this meant that he would never see the light of day outside the prison walls and would die in prison. As the bailiffs led him out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the room was dead silent. Ella's parents watched him go, realizing that no sentence would bring their daughter back, but at least the person who killed her would not harm anyone else. A separate episode of the trial was the testimony of Sarah, the same friend who drove Ella to the forest that fateful morning. She took the stand as a prosecution witness, describing in detail their last conversation in the car, Ella's laughter, and her plans for the weekend. Sarah was brave, but her voice was heavy with the guilt she had been carrying all these months. She blamed herself for not waiting longer, for not going to look for her friend herself, for even agreeing to give her a ride in the first place. After the hearing, Detective Michael Sorensen approached Sarah in the courtroom corridor. Such moments are not recorded in protocols or reports, but witnesses recalled that the experienced investigator, who usually avoided emotional conversations, told the girl something that was the dry truth of police statistics. He explained to her that it was impossible to predict an encounter with this type of criminal. Vance was a predator of opportunity. He didn't hunt Ella specifically, he just seized the moment. Nothing Sarah could have done could have changed what happened on the highway after dark. Today, years after the tragedy, there are no large memorials or memorial signs at the site where the body was found. Lake Tahoe remains the same as it has been for thousands of years, majestic, blue, cold, and completely indifferent to human drama. Tourists continue to come to the Rubicon Point viewpoint to take beautiful photos against the water. Boats cross the water surface, leaving white traces of foam behind them, and fishermen go out for morning fishing, not thinking about what is hiding in the dark depths under their boats. Ella Patton was buried in a small, quiet cemetery in the suburbs of Sacramento, near where her mother grew up. Her grave is always lined with fresh flowers, often yellow, like the jacket she wore on her last hike. Her case remains in the El Dorado County Police Archives under a number that is now used as a teaching example for young detectives. This story was a cruel reminder that crime is not always the result of a complex plan of a brilliant maniac, as shown in the movies. More often than not, it is the result of the cowardice of a small, insignificant person who, at a critical moment, decided that someone else's life was worth less than his own conditional freedom. And it is this banality of evil, its ordinariness and randomness, that frightens much more than any fictional mysticism of the dark forests.